Hey there, Chad here. This is Astrox Imperium, and this is my 5th episode on this. Today we're going to cover creating a sandbox game. So in the past we talked about the new campaign, which gives you a specific map to work with, and it's the same for everybody. Sandbox allows you to build your own galaxy or universe, however you want to look at it. So let's give that a quick look-see. Now, when you first come in, you come to the pilot details, and this is where you will generate the galaxy, but you don't want to do that yet. You want to set everything up first. And then you can go to presets. I have some presets I've already used. Station focused is kind of what I call it. I put one together called YouTube that kind of just has all of those settings, but gave me the name that I'm going to use and things like that. You can change all of this, and we're going to go through a couple of these. I don't know if I want to go through every last setting in here. There are a ton. For your pilot, this is your normal setup that you do at the beginning of the campaign game. You give yourself a profession and a faction that you're a member of. The different game modes. Free play is the basic one. There's the ability to play the original hostile space excavation game that was a precursor to Astrox Imperium, and then there's also a peaceful universe. I'm going to go with free play. Start options. This is what you start with as a player. I'm going to leave that alone myself. We're going to come back to Galaxy. That's one of the big ones. Skybox. I decided to lower the frequency of things in the background on the Skybox, and I also lowered the fog a little bit. Those are just visuals, and I don't necessarily need all that for myself. Stations will come back to, warp gates will come back to. Rest of these I kind of left alone. I might have nudged them maybe 5% in a particular direction, but that's about it. But as you can see, there's a ton of settings in here. How often resources spawn, how rare things are, how likely there are going to be clusters, things like this. You can set all sorts of stuff. Here in the economy, I think I've seen where a lot of people have been trying to play with this to see if they can get trade to work better. And as I stated in previous video, I have found that after a little bit of time inside of my sandbox, trade seems to open up and act more like I would expect, more like it does in the campaign mode. So I decided not to play with these too much. The two that maybe are a little important is this buy item price modifier and sell item price modifier. These are the percentages that prices are marked up or down in the market when you go to buy or sell. So anytime you go to sell something, it is going to immediately suffer a 50% penalty on what you will get paid for it. I'm assuming the price buy modifier does the same thing for the purchase price, and so they're set the same. So I think, at the end of the day, it probably balances out. If we put both of them at 100%, things will be more expensive, but I think the ratio would stay the same. I'm going to leave them alone. Shipyard frequency is included in here, and I've set it. I've left it at average. I think that's where it started. If you ever mess with stuff and you need to get back to it, you can go to presets and select the default settings. Strongly recommend don't delete this one because then you won't have it. Let's see, where were we? We were at economy missions. I kind of left that alone. I might have bumped up the generation rate 10%, something like that. The player ships, this is basically the stats on your ships. I didn't touch that. I didn't touch NPC ships or mercenaries or raiders or events. And then the extras have to do with turrets and star recharging. I haven't even touched those in the game yet, so I didn't mess with those. So let's go back to the three that I talked about: Galaxy, Stations, and Warp Gate. Let's start with Stations. So I like a lot of stations. And as I mentioned, my preset was called Station Focused. I bumped this all the way up to the top. I want as many stations as it'll give me. It, in my opinion, is still station sparse. I am very often running into sectors that only have one station or one or two stations. Two stations is probably okay. I probably am okay with that being the norm, but you don't see sectors that have 5 or 6 stations in them very often, particularly when this starts, I think, at average. It either starts at average or often. I've gone ahead and bumped that all the way up, and I am comfortable with the number of stations I have. I don't think it's too many. Station level, it can start at 1. I think that's where it starts. I bumped it up to 2. Not fully sure what this does. I assume it has to do with how many services are offered at a particular station. Refinery speed I left alone. I might have messed with that actually a little bit, but long story short, you can change how fast the refinery will work, the fabricator will work, the university training speed, and other things. Repair. Is this the cost of repairs? Yeah, cost of repairs of your modules and your armor. How much it costs to lease space. I actually bumped. I might have bumped this up. I like having the ability to rent space. I think that's important. And I think this just changes how large each chunk is. Then the storage lease cost, I've left it 1 credit per cubic meter. I prefer there not to be dock fees, but you can't get rid of them. But you can bump it way down. I don't like dock fees, and I don't like the warp gate fees. So I'm going to talk about those here in just a moment for the warp gate fees. But for the station dock fee, I bumped it down. It will not go below 1%. It's where it bottoms out. Next, let's talk about the galaxy. Okay, so here's where you can set how many sectors there will be. I've chosen to go with 100. It can be as low as, I think, 5, and it can go up to like 400. 500. It goes up to 500. To create a 100-sector universe with the settings that I have, it takes my system about, let's call it 2 minutes. It's a little under 2 minutes to completely create that. I would expect that as you bump that up, that becomes exponentially longer. I have no idea what it would top out at. Also, I think that 100 sectors is more than enough for what I would do when I'm playing. Sector layout. So this is interesting. You can make the map look different. It can have different shapes. There's a few different shapes, and we'll talk about them real quick. The first one is butterfly, and it kind of, when you look at it from the top, it looks a little like a butterfly. It kind of narrows in on the sides and the top and bottom, and it sprawls out on the corners. It's an interesting little effect. We then have rounded. Rounded is kind of just a square. Doesn't have a whole lot of weird features in it from what I can see. Grid, it looks like a grid. Very much linear, left to right and top to bottom. Then we have spiral. Spiral is interesting. It literally spirals. It goes in. Most of these maps so far have been kind of 2-dimensional. They are 3-dimensional, but there's not a whole lot of up and down in them. They're relatively flat, easy to look at from above. The spiral one looks like a funnel. It starts at the bottom and it spins upward until you get to the outer side. You'll also notice that the middle is always the high security sectors. That's what I have it set to. That's down here. And then the outer edges are the low security sectors. And if you roll over it in the map, you'll see that. Now, to get these maps so that you can see those little examples I gave, I set this to all explored. However, when I play, I set it to unexplored. And what I would say is get your settings where you want them. Make a note of the seed you use. And if you really want to look at the map and see if it's something that you like, do an all explored version of it. Then delete it, come back. Well, you'd want to save your preset, then delete your game, come back, set your seed, pick that preset, and then just set this over here, and then everything that isn't explored is hidden. And that's probably, you call it fog of war, whatever you want. This is how I prefer to start the game. However, to see if the map makes sense, I do generate them this way first, and then I go back and regenerate them with everything turned off. Okay. Allow warp drives. This allows you to use warp drives or not. Warp drives are items you can add. They're passive. They allow you to jump to any sector whenever you like. There's a cost of fuel that you have to purchase. I do have that set to true. The default is that those are turned on. Sector environment, sector security. Oh, I'm sorry, we didn't finish these, did we? So we got to spiral. There's a couple more. Next is cluster. Cluster looks a lot like rounded to me. There's a couple of differences in it, but nothing worth writing home about. With that said, probably the one I would use if I don't use random. And random is the last one, and it is quite a bit more random. There are star systems that are almost immediately adjacent. It's very difficult to click on them. There's distant star systems and warp gates that, traverse different distances to get to those. Okay, so this is personal preference, whatever you really like. I think butterfly is an interesting looking one. Then, we have random and cluster. Now, the thing is this doesn't control the number of warp gates. So whatever you pick here, it's more about the shape. Also, you'll notice, I noticed this on spiral. You start in the middle on spiral, security is 10, and then as you work your way into each of the next segments, the security goes down by 0.2 each time until you get all the way down to 0. That's kind of interesting to me. And I noticed as I went through some of these other ones then, like cluster, exactly the same thing happens. Your starting sector is 10, and then you can kind of see the direction that it was built, and each sector from there goes down by 0.2. Okay, enough about that. I'm going to set it to random. Let's talk about warp gates. This is the last important one in my mind. So this determines how many warp gates will exist in your universe. There's also whether or not there is a toll for the gates. I set that to 0. I prefer there not to be a toll. Warp gate frequency and warp gate links. These seem to work together, and I'm not entirely sure exactly how, but let me tell you what I've seen. If I set this all the way to 1, every sector will have 1 or 2 warp gates. And if you're like, it almost works like the spiral. Even if you do the grid, each one will point to one segment, and then you'll have 2 warp gates for that one. And it just kind of goes around in a circle to make that happen. So getting from your starting sector all the way out to a 0 security sector is going to be 50 or so jumps. That's probably important to note. You can also set it all the way out here to 8, and that would be the maximum. Each sector could have up to 8 warp gates pointing to other items. In grid, if you were to do this, basically every center point is connected to everything orthogonal to it and everything diagonal to it. Almost everything is connected. Everything can get virtually everywhere very, very quickly. I prefer to set it somewhere in the middle. In fact, I had chosen 4. Then I started looking at this warp gate frequency. The option will allow you to adjust the frequency that warp gates will use to spawn, and also whether or not they have a toll. I don't know what this second part means. I would think that has to do with the warp gate toll modifier. I suppose there's some sort of factor here, but it isn't very clear. But what I can tell you is if I set this all the way out to 8, and I set this all the way out to never, I get a very linear universe regardless of the shape. Every sector has 1 or 2 warp gates, and that's it. If I set this to 1 link and I set this to very frequent, actually the same thing. Everything will have 1 or 2 warp gates. Your starting sector generally has 1. Everything else will have 2 as it moves around the board. So what do these do? What it looks to me like, if I set this to say 6, and then I set this to rare or average, I tend to get a dispersal of gates that looks a little more random. I'll have some sectors that have 6 gates. I'll have some that only have 2 or 3. That's kind of where I like to have it play. So what I did is I set it to 4, and then I set it to, I think, average, either average or often. And I felt like I got a reasonably good disbursement of warp gates for my random galaxy. Now, if you're using the grid galaxy, you still have this very much, diagonal and orthogonal kind of chart where everything either goes left and right or diagonally away or up and down. And you can see that there's like avenues to get to each outer ring as you go. There's several rings in the circle of your galaxy when that happens. Setting this higher would make it so that there are more jumps out from the current quote unquote ring. Setting it lower means they're going to be less. So you might have to play with this. I literally just created about 30 galaxies of all different kinds, playing with the warp gate frequency to kind of figure out what that was looking like. I also played with the station frequency to get that where I liked it. And these are the settings that I've landed with. Now, one thing I noticed in creating all of those galaxies is I kept using the same seed, this number right here. Kept using that seed, and when I use this seed, well, let's go ahead and generate this galaxy, and I'll show you what I'm kind of getting at here. We'll go ahead and leave that. I just make sure I didn't change anything on my setup here. Very frequent. No, I think we're good there. So we go back out to Pilot. We'll go ahead and just keep these settings for now and generate the galaxy. So when you generate the galaxy, over here on the left, you're going to get a list of numbers of what's happening. And what I noticed is when I use a specific seed, all of these stay identical with a couple of exceptions. Depending on what I set stations to, this will change. But for having stations set to its maximum, this is always going to end up on the same number when I use a particular seed. It'll always be really close to 200. I think I saw as many as 218, and I saw as few as 192. So there we have 203. These numbers down here, planets, clouds, fog, all of this is always identical. Resources identical, NPCs identical. Then the warp gates change based on how I set the warp gate settings. Otherwise, everything using a specific seed gets generated in exactly the same way, which is exactly what you want to do with procedural world generation. What I'm trying to point out, though, is even if I did a spiral galaxy or a grid galaxy or any of the other settings, I got the same names in here for my various sectors. I always, with that particular number, I always start in Jophianowin as my home sector. It always has a horizons station that's, where is it? Oh, I kept turning that on, don't I? Which is right over here. A little bit left. I think this was our starting view. Yep, behind the ship here. So with that particular seed, I always have this station here. I always have this public building here. That's what it always looks like every time, regardless of the galaxy or the galaxy settings, the sector settings. We can fire that up, and this would be the map that I would start to play. Now, you'll notice I don't see everything now because I had turned that off. If we don't even see these if we roll to them, actually, come to think of it, because we haven't been there yet. So we won't see any information on these until we visit them. I do like that. And I really only have the one station to go to for now. So we'll head into there. So despite turning the warp gates should have no fee, but even turning this down to 1%, I still have a docking fee of 100. I think this is a minimum. Didn't seem to matter what I set that percentage to. First stations always seem to be around 100. We'll go ahead and go in there. Now this one has everything it looks like, so I can get started in my game. All right, well, I hope that helps you understand the basic setup for the sandbox and how you might want to manipulate that in getting started. The game otherwise plays like you would expect, the one difference being in my current sector, I don't have a whole bunch of stations to trade with. I'm going to have to go out and look for those. And in the meantime, I'm going to want to stop in stations and collect prices and see where things sit. I am going to want to continue to sort by discount of supply items and see where I'm at. So again, early in the game, I'm not seeing really big deductions. You have to go around a little bit, and these will slowly kind of drop to where you can start to get good trade deals. Okay, I think that's it for this episode. I appreciate your time. Hope you found something useful here in setting up a sandbox for yourself. And until next time, fair travels.